Hey everyone, I had an engineer friend over the other day who said that he really liked the chorus sound on the guitar in this track I was working on. So let's take a quick listen to that. So what's fun about this is that isn't a chorus effect at all. That's actually just multiple guitar takes of the same riff played, but the guitar has a harmonic tremolo on it. So I thought it would be fun to recreate this sound and talk about a few variations of using a modulation effect that is not chorus when playing a part multiple times to get something that's kind of similar to the what I consider cheesy chorus effect that you get from a guitar pedal and turning it into something a little more human. So I've drawn a few waveforms here, and let's say this black one is the original waveform. So what an old guitar pedal would do was it would use a delay effect to copy the signal a few times, and then it would wiggle the copied signal back and forth across the original waveform. And if you remember a little bit about your physics, you would remember that, of course, if you have the same waveform interfering with itself, you're going to get a little bit of cancellation. So by moving the waveform back and forth, it would change what the cancellation was, but you also had multiple actual copies of the signal. So it would sound kind of like there were multiple instruments playing at the same time. Now, of course, one of the nice things about having a chorus pedal is that if you're doing this live, of course you can't play two instruments at the same time. You can't play two guitar parts. And if you're not recording it, you might not even be able to have two guitarists play them simultaneously such that it's close enough that it's good enough for the actual sound. But sometimes when you're recording, it can sound pretty cheesy. It's not actually two guitars, but it's trying to sort of sound like them, and maybe the exact phase cancellation that you're getting doesn't really sound great. And also, to be fair, it's a pretty dated effect. So it was used all over the place on 80s guitars, and part of the reason was, well, at the time, a lot of people didn't want a guitar to sound like a guitar. They wanted a guitar to sound like a keyboard or something. So let's just explore one of the ways to get a sound that is kind of similar, but since we have the power of the studio, and we're also going to take some advantage of the fact that this is still an analog effect that we're using. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show that you can actually do this with different types of modulations. So what's going to be important is that there is some sort of phasing effect. So I've grabbed an actual phaser. This is a clone of a pretty famous optical phaser, but you could use something as simple as a phase 45, and maybe it would even be better if it's pretty subtle. Let me talk briefly about what I'm going to use to recreate the sound. The first, of course, is the electric guitar. And while I have two guitars sitting here, I am going to use the same guitar for multiple takes. I'm going to do 2 takes of the same riff on the same guitar in the same settings. And part of the reason is to keep some of that sameness that you get from a guitar pedal, where it's just copying the signal and moving it around. But we do want a little bit of differentiation that comes from a human playing the same part twice. So this isn't stacking guitars like you might do on a rock record to make very thick sounding guitars. It's just getting another take with some differentiation, but played as closely as possible to the original. And the interest is going to come from the guitar pedal that we add for modulation. For the guitar amp, I'll be using my Tone King Imperial on its rhythm channel. This is a blackface Fender sound, a very, very common amp sound. I'll be miking it with a Biodynamic 201 right up against the speaker grill. And the only thing that I think is important about this is because we're using a harmonic tremolo, which wiggles the bass and the treble out of phase with each other, we just want to make sure that we're retaining enough bandwidth to keep that sound interesting. I've got the reverb on 4. I think a little bit of reverb helps, but maybe isn't super critical. We'll be recording the tracks in Logic Pro. I won't be using any of Logic Pro's plugins, so feel free to use whatever DAW is your favorite. For the pedal board, I'll be using a Bear Hug compressor. That's over here. And the reason for the compressor is just to even out some of the dynamics. Because we're playing the same part twice, we want to keep it as similar as possible. When I recorded the original track, I had the Strymon El Capistan running on a very low setting. However, I don't think it's critical to the sound, and it may just confuse things, so I won't be using a delay. Feel free, of course, to use a delay if you like it. And the big piece of the puzzle is our modulation effect. So I've got a cardinal on the board right here. This is the tap tempo version, but you don't need a tap tempo version. Although I believe that most harmonic tremolo pedal effects that you get these days are digital, and therefore they might have a tap tempo. So this shouldn't be too far off from what you can get commercially if you're not into building things yourself. All right, I'm ready to get started here. I've got the depth on the harmonic tremolo set at halfway. I don't want anything super crazy, so this is a pretty good sound for layering. You can definitely hear the effect happening, and that's what's important. All right. We've got 3 takes to play with here, so let's go ahead and duplicate this track, and we'll copy and paste it and use a different take on each track. Which is, of course, the whole reason for doing the overdubs. And since we've got 3 tracks, we can do left, right, and center. And let's take a quick listen. So pretty similar to what we heard before. Let's go ahead and make a track stack here real quick. And we're going to call this attempt 1. Because there are some variations that we can talk about to perhaps make this a little more interesting sounding. So one variation, of course, is I mentioned you could use a different form of modulation. So let's try it with a phaser pedal, for instance. But the second thing I'm going to do before we try out the phaser pedal is just a small variation with the harmonic tremolo. So one of the things you can do by doing these overdubs like this is that you can, I mean, of course, you can change your playing, but we want to keep the playing as similar as possible. What we want to do is we want to change what the modulation is doing so that it changes how we perceive the effect of multiple things at once. And one of the things you can play with is the rate. So what might happen if we adjust the pedal on the pedal board to have a different rate, a slightly faster rate for the second take and a slightly slower rate for the third take. So let's go ahead and set that up and see what happens. Treat these similarly. You can see that they're already panned because we just duplicated the tracks. And let's give this one a listen. Okay, except for some dynamics differences between those takes. The first take was a little bit quieter than the other ones. It is a much richer sound, so let's go ahead and compare it. This one. Alright, so let's go ahead and set up the phaser and see what that sounds like. Okay, the phaser pedal is all set up. I've set the depth quite low. This pedal can get very, very, very crazy sounding, so you really don't need much depth at all to imitate kind of a similar sound to what we were getting out of the harmonic tremolo. And I've got the rate set at a fairly moderate rate. I didn't try to exactly match the tempo like we did on the first attempt of the harmonic tremolo, but there's plenty of wiggle room to change where the rate is set so that we can get a couple different sounds when we go ahead and do that. So let's hit record. Okay, let's listen back to attempt 3. So this one sounds a lot more like a typical chorus sound. It's got a lot more of the kind of wateryness that I associate with a typical chorus. So let's do one last thing. Let's just record one dry take and apply a chorus plugin to it. I know I said earlier I wasn't really going to use Logic's plugins, but this is just kind of a demonstration of what a typical chorus sounds like, and maybe I should have done this earlier in the video. Okay, so let's apply a chorus effect to that, and we'll compare it to the other takes we did. So we're gonna go mono to stereo. Normally your typical chorus pedal wouldn't be stereo, but I believe actually the Boss one might, the typical Boss chorus pedal might be. So I'm gonna bump up the intensity a little bit. And this is mostly me just trying to get kind of a typical chorus sound, and also make it as much of an apples to apples comparison to the other takes. We did multiple takes and we panned them, so we have to do something stereo, and they were all the same volume, so we're going to make the mix 50% here, and let's just see what it sounds like. Now compare it to attempt 3. And I said this one sounds more like a typical chorus to me. Get the volume a little better matched. And then we can compare it to attempt 1, which again, the harmonic tremolo is my preferred modulation effect, especially for stacking. It's just a little less crazy and maybe a little less dated sounding. Ironic, since it's the older effect between all of these. So I want to talk about some of my takeaways. The big thing is that applying something like a chorus effect or an automatic double tracker, flanging, which was invented because Phil Spector was trying to get a bigger sounding vocal by putting 2 performances on a reel-to-reel and slowing them down with his fingers alternatively. The automatic double tracker that the Beatles invented because they got tired of overdubbing their vocals so much, or even just a lot of times people will just put a short delay on something, a really short delay on something to make it sound bigger. Doing that doesn't necessarily make it sound more of an orchestrated part, and I mean orchestrated in the sense of like played in an orchestra where you have several people all playing the same part on slightly different instruments. I mean, each violin is separate. Each player of the violin is separate, and you can't get that just by taking the same part and duplicating it. So this really is my preferred way of handling that situation. I have the freedom, because I'm recording a song, to record my part that I wrote multiple times. If I were mixing somebody else's track, I probably wouldn't be able to do that, because I probably wouldn't have the instrument that they played it on. If I were programming instruments, I might not get that. I can go over to the keyboard and I can play something and run it through the MIDI, but if I'm using a sample and I played them almost the same thing, then I should be triggering the sample at the same time, and I'm probably not getting something that's quite the same as using an analog instrument played multiple times. Especially if I were to like copy and paste the MIDI, I wouldn't get multiple performances. I'd have to use a different set of samples, which is not quite getting the same effect as this variation on a chorus pedal. So as I said, the primary goal here for me was to come up with something that was kind of similar to the sound that people are familiar with going all the way back to the 80s from a guitar pedal effect chorus, but getting something that sounds a little less dated and frankly a little more human. And that's usually the goal with any of my recordings and my playing. Is I'm very interested in getting to the human aspect of a song. It always bothered me a little bit when I had to program the drums for a few of my records, and I still can't play them that well, but at least it's played by a human now, and that's just something that I want to hear as a listener, and I prefer it when I'm producing my own music. So with that in mind, I hope you've enjoyed my attempt to change up a familiar guitar effect. If you've got your own way that you like to stack instruments to create a kind of chorusy sounding effect, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, and I hope some of you find this useful and can use it in your own recordings. Thanks for watching.